Hey, what's up everyone? We're a few days in and I hit level 80 earlier today, and I've been keeping notes to share with you about some surprising things I've learned along the way that make exiting cruel and pushing the map smoother, which I'll share with you here. There are a few things like some hidden free resists, some trade tips, map sustain, and generating currency that I'm sure will help some of you, and I'll try to keep it all very concise. I'm also going to do a 2-for-1 and give a build update now that gas grenades have been nerfed. As you can see here, they haven't been nerfed significantly. There is an important mechanical reason for this, which I'll get into at the end of the video, where I'll explain in depth exactly how it delivers so much damage, as well as talk about a unique item that makes this a one-button S-tier mapping build. Let's start with one of the more surprising things that I didn't learn about until maps. There is a hidden quest in Acts 2 and 4 that will give you 20% lightning resist permanently. There are no quest markers, there are no directions, nothing on the map, and I think of the 10 or so people that I've talked to, only 2 knew about it. There's an area called the Spires of Dashar in A2 and A4, and if you walk through here, this is where the giant skeleton boss is. There's also a side area with a checkpoint and a clickable shrine called the Shrine of the Sisters. Each one of these will give you plus 10 lightning resistance permanently. Next, once you get into maps, you're going to care about defense a lot more. To that end, you should be salvaging superior gear that you find on the ground. Each one of the quality currencies sells for something like 6 or 7 to an Exile, and the quality currency doesn't drop that often, so being able to fish it off of gear off the ground is really important, especially for your defense and then later for generating currency. Before we get into the mechanical discussion, I'm going to show you some quick gameplay. This is a T12. I think this is the first T12 I ran. I basically just run around. I have one button, it's on left click, and I throw the gas grenades, and the ignited enemies, thanks to the helmet, just blow the grenades up for me. This is 4 link damage. My 5th link right now is Inspiration, which is totally fine to drop. I could use a mana flask and that works perfectly well, but I just don't really feel like I need more damage at the moment. I'll show you what it looks like when I'm fighting an Essence monster or something pinkier, but it feels pretty good. The clear is great. I have no complaints. Okay, with that stuff out of the way, let's talk about gas grenades and how I've set them up to do a lot of damage. And unless they're nerfed again, this will be the vehicle I use deep into endgame instead of explosive grenade or cluster grenade. The first and most important thing to know is that gas grenades have 2 forms. The first is the grenade itself, which has a fuse, flies through the air, and will let off a gas cloud when the fuse expires. The second form is the gas cloud itself. The cloud grows in area over time and will coalesce with other gas clouds to form a single large cloud if you let them go long enough. Both of these forms are ignitable and can do a lot of damage. However, only the grenade itself is capable of AoE shotgunning, which, as I've said several times before, is one of the biggest multipliers in Path of Exile. To get the 5x damage multiplier when throwing 5 gas grenades, you need to detonate the grenade before it turns into gas. And I do this by throwing it on an ignited enemy. By hitting an enemy on fire, you're able to bypass the fuse duration, which makes the build feel much smoother. There are a few ways to do this. The first is oil grenade and what I was doing on day 2. I've been talking with Palstron though the day before and discussing a unique helmet, Radiant Grief, which can also solve for the ignite. There's a pair of boots that do the same thing, but it only has 15% move speed on it, so I would not recommend that for pushing into endgame, because movement speed is such a rare stat. So why does this work? One reason is that the spread of the grenades doesn't change with the area of effect. It only changes with projectile count. Watch where the grenades stop when I add and remove the magnified effect support gem. There are a couple different things we can learn from this watching the projectile spread. The first and most important is that stacking AoE has no downside, only upside to your damage. Larger explosion radii mean larger maximal effective damage area, which means things die faster. The second is that the farther away you are from the target, the less damage you'll do. I don't mean that you need to care about accuracy, but instead I mean that the farther the grenades are apart, the fewer overlaps you will have. This is one of the reasons why Deadeye's extra projectile isn't quite as strong as it looks on paper, because in order to get the 20% more damage that a 6th projectile would provide, you'd need to perfectly align the interior edge of the leftmost grenade with the interior edge of the rightmost grenade. Or use the extra projectile base and drop scatter shot and add in another damage support. Another way I've effectively scaled damage with gas grenade is by using ignite related supports. Because we aren't using an ignition source like explosive shot, we can rely on the ignite, which means strong supports like immolate add substantial damage. The damage you see here is in fact 4 link damage, because I'm using Inspiration as my 5th support. I'll probably work on solving for mana a bit later. It works just fine without Inspiration. You'll just need a mana flask more frequently than without it. Let's take a quick look at my passive tree. I've made several pretty significant changes since we last looked at it. The first is I've dropped this entire wheel. It's really not necessary. I have so much damage that I just don't need anymore. And I've primarily focused on cooldown recovery rate. I've gotten it basically everywhere. The only node I don't have is here, and I might end up getting that one too at some point. The second priority is AoE. I've got this wheel, I've got the Colossal Weapon taken here, and I've got most of this wheel with Authority taken. Then after that, it's just generically strong things like repeating explosives, the entire grenade wheel, some movement speed here from Adrenaline Rush, which actually feels pretty good. And then all of the rest of it is armor and evasion scaling. So this wheel I've taken, I'm pushing over on the left side here into the warrior area of the tree to take sturdy metal and some other things. I'm probably going to path to this wheel next to grab blade catcher, which looks absurd. And the reason I've been leaning into armor and evasion besides the obvious defensive one is that I'm going to go into sorcery ward next. I don't really feel like I need more damage. I'm basically on a 4-link and I'm deleting everything in T10s. So I would like to have some more defense. And I have about 11k armor and evasion right now, which will give me about 2200 sorcery ward. If we look at the quality on sorcery ward, it gives us another 10%. And then we can boost that up to 50% once I get my 4th ascendancy. I sort of put this off because I was malding a little bit since I ran Sanctum floor 2 before it was widely known that you needed to do the 3rd floor, since I was sort of rushing it. And one last note on the passive tree, keep in mind this is all a work in progress and we're learning things as we go. Mobalytics is working on a series of updates where we can do passive tree progressions, but until that's out, you'll need to check the text in the build guide itself. I'll leave some notes about what I think optimal progression is. When we get deeper into endgame, I'll put together a complete comprehensive build guide. Like if you've followed any of the guides I've done in PoE 1, it'll be in that type of format. Okay, let's review the skills and how I have them linked. So the primary damage dealer is Gas Grenade. I'm using Scatter Shot to give me 2 additional projectiles, Immolate because it gives us a 30% free damage, and if you're using Radiant Grief, you get Ignite for free, Primal Armament for 25% more weapon elemental damage, and Inspiration to reduce the cost so that it's way more manageable. Now, you don't need Inspiration. This is totally doable on a Mana Flask, but I basically don't need my Mana Flask right now. Oil Grenade is still an exceptional single target support. I use it for slowing the enemy and exposure, and then that exposure is further boosted by Strip Away, which gives us 30% increased effect of exposure. I use Persistence to make it last longer, and Magnified Effect to make it larger. Flash Grenade is actually really important, especially when there's a really dense map. Flash Grenade will blow everybody away from you, stun them. I also have Maim on here to make them slow. I've added Overpower, which will cause additional stun buildup, and Ingenuity so that I can do this more frequently if I need to. This is particularly effective in content like Ritual, which is extremely dangerous, especially with walls, for getting overpowered. The next thing I have is a Ripwire Ballista. I don't use this very often. It's basically just a decoy totem like thing. It allows me to maim an enemy and not have to think about doing it. It was useful for bosses in campaign, although I haven't used it much in maps. I've also got Voltaxic Grenade here. I've been experimenting with it. I was hoping that I could get Stormfire to give me permanent shocks on the enemy, but I'm just testing this, so I'm not exactly sure what this will end up being. My auras are Herald of Ash with Vitality and Wind Dancer, which is great at keeping me alive, and Clarity. All right, that's all I have for now. Next update will be when I get to T16s and we start pushing some bossing content. I'll talk to you guys soon.